Prostitution isn't liberation. So there is a long-standing sort of uh, use of rhetoric, I guess you could call it, within liberal circles and certain feminist circles that prostitution is somehow quote unquote liberating and that it's this empowering thing. And I want to sort of attack that. So the first thing is that liberation or empowerment is not the same as having sex on tap and large amounts of validation. Of course, people love the idea of having all of these different people thinking that they are hot and having sex on tap. Better yet, being paid to engage in the sex act. I mean, it sounds like a wonderful idea when you think about it, but it's not liberating, and I'm going to get at why. Number one, I think the reason why this is used in liberal sort of feminist circles a lot is because they are biting back against the idea of what they call purity culture. And I have several problems with this. Number one, the main problem that I have with this is I don't think that the preference of a lot of men to want a woman with a low body count is equivalent to oppression. I just don't agree. And it's a preference, it's a personal preference, is all it is. And I think that's what the liberating talk comes out of is knowing that I can sort of satiate my desires without sort of uh, giving up necessarily or feeling like I'm giving up the prospects of the kind of man that I want. And that's just simply not how reality works. But there's another element here that I think we need to sort of get at and tackle more so, and that is this. For the vast majority of people, women and queer people in particular, this is not a choice. And it's not a choice in the meaningful sense of the word. And I find it disturbing that many today on the left, particularly the online left, seem to be all in support of uh, sex work, essentially, which is an extraordinary thing because when you think about it, those individuals are telling on themselves. Think about it. If I'm so passionate about defending cookies, okay, let's just put that out there, and that everyone should have access to chocolate cookies, what am I really saying? That I should have access to chocolate cookies. Do you see what I'm saying? And I'm very skeptical when it comes to people, for example, the romanticists, when it comes to literature, whether it be Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, or whether it be Lord Byron, and so on and so forth. Many of these individuals preached polyamory and polygamy. They said we need to have free love and so on and so forth. Well, what does that really mean? That means Milton gets to have sex with a lot of different women. That's really what he's getting at, functionally speaking. Now, granted, I am sort of using a Freudo-Marxist framework to analyze these things, but I think that's an important thing nonetheless. And I have an essay talking about the importance of Freudo-Marxism on my Substack, Seven Commandments. So that's the first thing I wanted to get at is I'm very skeptical of the individuals that are sort of passionate, usually cis straight men, I might add, who are so passionate about defending the industry of the sex trade that they don't realize that they are telling on themselves, and it's laughable at best. That's the first thing that I want to point out. Number two is that the international left, traditionally, going all the way back to Karl Marx himself, actually, when you think about it, has always been opposed to the sex trade. And that is not to say opposed to the workers themselves, actually. The idea is to be in solidarity with the individual workers, but rather to acknowledge that structural issues are at the heart of this, and that this is essentially In the same way that all labour is to a degree exploitation, this is exploitation of the worst kind. That is, of the most intimate side of a person. The fact of the matter is that if you understand Martin or Karl Marx and his notion of contradiction, which he borrows from Martin or Hegel, then you understand that every market transaction is essentially a contradiction. That on the one hand, I am trying to get the maximum product that I can for the least amount of money, and then the person on the other side is trying to get the maximum amount of money they can for the least amount of product. Well, the problem with the sex trade, and this is what the left have recognized since the beginning, is that it is rather unique because the contradiction at hand is not happening on the counter at the store, for example. It's happening literally within your body. And what does that mean? That means boundaries will be crossed, lines will be crossed, and things are not ever going to be clearly negotiated, and they can't be clearly negotiated. That's the other problem, is when dealing with something like this, you can't have the boundaries that you otherwise could have definitionally. And so when people say if a prostitute is subjected to rape, is that in fact shoplifting? I know it's a rather cynical line of reasoning, but it's a worthy line of reasoning if we are to acknowledge the legitimacy of this trade in the first place. Obviously, I would argue that she was subject to rape. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm offering is a critique of the industry itself. The other thing that we need to think about here is that there have been plenty of societies and cultures that historically, for example, Polynesia, that were never repressive when it came to human sexuality. Quite the opposite. They embraced it and celebrated it, but nonetheless didn't have the sex trade. And I think that's important to sort of take into account. Many civilizations within India, for example, didn't have this. Yes, there were the temple prostitutes and stuff, we know that, often used to justify British colonialism, but there were also many that didn't. And that's an important conversation to be had. Why is that? Because there is this sort of pessimistic thinking that it's always going to be here. Number one, that it's the oldest profession. And that's not true. Think about it. What is the oldest profession? It's not prostitution. It can't be. It's hunting and fishing. Think about it. How else did we eat? You literally have to have sustenance in order to be able to reproduce in the first place. So it's not the oldest profession. That's number one, a myth. Number two, it is not an inevitability as human history shows, even in market economies and so on and so forth. And so what does this mean? This means that I go further than many leftists who say we need to make it so that economically it's not necessary, but people can choose nonetheless. This is what I would argue. If we make the material conditions such that it is not necessary anymore for certain people, because let's be honest, prostitution at present for many people in terms of survival is a necessity. If we make it so that it's not a necessity, then I don't believe people will freely engage with it. I don't believe in this notion that people will choose to do so. If you think about it, if we raise the baseline material standard universally for all, then I reject the view that there's always going to be someone, that it's always going to exist. Again, the variation in terms of human history shows this to be true, because Polynesia, certain Indian civilizations, and so on and so forth, did have a baseline material standard. The other thing that I think needs to be taken into account is that it's often, and I think this is important in terms of consent, and I know a lot of people on the red pill and stuff are going to reject what I'm going to say, but I think this is important. And I don't think we need to involve the law, but nonetheless it warrants a conversation across cultures, across communities, churches, synagogues, mosques, covens and so on and so forth. And that is this: the vast majority of people that are harmed in that intimate a manner, if you know what I'm talking about, as a child, do not go on to enter into the sex trade. That's a lie. But the vast majority of people in the sex trade have been harmed in that manner as children. And I think that's important to take into account because I think it highlights issues around consent. And is that meaningful consent? This is again something I'm very critical of when it comes to liberal feminist circles, is this idea of consent and consent alone. Consent is important, yes, but I think number one, the material conditions in which one agrees to give consent is the most important. And that's number one. And number two, I think there's a more nuanced conversation to be had around a person's background and so on and so forth. And is that consenting? And not in a sort of degrading, paternalistic way. We sort of have, like 19-year-old woman saying, I was groomed. I'm not meaning that. That's silly. But like I said, the fact that their outlook or whatever has been distorted on this subject, I think that's worth taking into account. And as a result, there needs to be a conversation to be had around therapy and so on and so forth. If I were to have it my way, personally, and I don't know how I would pull this off legally or whatever, but first and foremost, economically, no reason for anyone to have to do it. That's number one. And number two, in a non penalizing manner, a non criminalizing manner, that they have to wait until 25. That is what I would push for if it were up to me. If I were the supreme ruler of all of the earth and so on and so forth, that is what I would institute. And again, in a non penalizing manner. Traditional Maori warriors, this didn't always happen, this was not always so, blah blah blah, but it was the ideal, particularly if he was highborn, would wait until they were at least 30 years of age, until they experienced combat for the first time. Until that point, they were trained in the art of warfare, ancient warfare, since birth. And I think so the example given, the sort of explanation given, was that the Modi, the life force, is fully developed by that point. But I think that it's no coincidence that the brain is fully formed at 25, between 25 and 30, roughly, and that the ancestors had deduced that a warrior is best to experience combat for the first time at roughly 30 onwards. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I don't think it's necessarily an insight that is necessarily unique to Māori either. Perhaps many other cultures thought something similar or whatever. And it is that principle that I use. Many women, for example, involved in the sex trade today have PTSD at the level of a combat veteran, which shows you the amount that they've been through. They have been diagnosed with PTSD at that level. People that served in Fallujah in Iraq, they demonstrate the same symptoms as such people. So it shows you that this is by no means some sort of liberating thing. It's sold as this sort of hedonistic party and so on and so forth. And of course, as a choice, that it's everyone's choice. That is the sort of thing that's been advertised. Personal choice, consent, and so on and so forth. I think the best way to understand prostitution, and this has always been the traditional leftist understanding of prostitution, is that it is the choice of those with the least choices.